Good evening. I'm John Godfrey, Chair of the Wallenberg Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 24th presentation of the Wallenberg Medal on this unusually beautiful evening for early November in Ann Arbor. Tonight, we honor a person of exceptional courage who is a defender of human dignity and humanitarian values. And we remember Raoul Wallenberg, who was shaped by his experience as a student at the University of Michigan as he came into adulthood. This past August, the passenger halls of Budapest's Western Railway station filled with desperate refugees from Syria and Iraq, many seeking passage to asylum in Sweden. Just over 70 years ago, at this same station, in July 1944, a figure slipped off a train coming from the opposite direction, wearing a long leather coat and carrying a sleeping bag, a windbreaker, and 2 knapsacks that held personal belongings, notebooks with lists of names, an unusually large amount of cash, a revolver he hoped not to use, and a Swedish diplomatic passport. 10 years before his arrival in Budapest, Wallenberg had been a student at the University of Michigan. It was here he found asylum from burdening expectations of home. It was here he could slip from his circumstances as a scion of Sweden's preeminent family of bankers and industrialists and shake loose the expectations placed on him for a dazzling career in business or banking. It was here he seized the opportunity to find his own starting point on his own terms as a student of architecture and art who loved music and prized friendship. In Ann Arbor, Wallenberg adopted a sort of disguise. Raoul became Rudy. He worked hard to be just another Michigan student. Only a couple of faculty in architecture knew his prominent family background, and they kept his secret. He wrote to his mother and grandfather expressing delight in his freedom, describing his legendary summer hitchhiking adventures across the U.S. He was inventive, resourceful, and loved living by his wits. When he hitchhiked, he saw that drivers were likely to stop and offer a lift to someone in uniform, so he often wore his ROTC uniform on these travels. Once, while hitchhiking near Chicago, Wallenberg found himself wedged in the back seat between 2 men when one waved a gun. They drove to a wooded area where they robbed him. They were the ones who were frightened, he coolly wrote his mother. Maybe because I was so calm. I really didn't feel scared. I found the whole thing kind of interesting. He needed this calm when, 10 years later in Budapest, identity and identification had become a matter of life and death. Wallenberg organized scores of volunteers who forged, printed, and distributed Swedish protection passes to tens of thousands of Jews in Budapest's ghettos or in hiding throughout the city. He bribed Germans and Hungarian police and bought safe houses. He became a recognized figure on Budapest streets. He handed out documents, thin fictions printed in the blue and yellow colors of Sweden and bearing the 3 crowns of its coat of arms, designed to impress German soldiers instilled with respect for official papers. He went to freight yards to pull Jews from trains destined for Auschwitz, declaring that these people were now under the protection of the Swedish government and could not be arrested and deported. By December 1944, as the Soviet army approached Budapest and the Hungarian government collapsed, the streets of the city were given over to bands of Hungarian fascists who rounded up Jews to shoot them and dump their bodies in the freezing Danube. The efforts of Wallenberg and other diplomats were coming undone. Approaching Soviet forces bombed and shelled the city, and house-to-house fighting began. Wallenberg refused to take shelter in the safe precincts of the Swedish embassy. He went underground and moved nightly among his safe houses on the eastern bank of the Danube to try to ensure the safety of the people under Sweden's protection. On January 6, 1945, from the top of Buda Castle Hill, Wallenberg stood with his Hungarian aide, watching flashes of Soviet artillery roll along the horizon above the Danube. He returned to his car and wedged himself into the back seat between two heavily armed Hungarian policemen assigned to protect him. This reminds me of the time when I was held up by bandits in the States, when I was hitchhiking back to Ann Arbor from Chicago. My life was in less danger then. Exhausted, he traced the thin thread that had fashioned the optimistic adventurousness of a Michigan student into a man living in the apocalyptic vista of a city given to murder and collapsing under siege. 10 days later, Wallenberg disappeared, arrested by Soviet secret police, and sent to an unknown fate. The past often is not so far away. It folds, it bends forward, and intrudes into our present. The spirit of Raoul Wallenberg is here in his university that he loved and wished to see again. And it filters through the passenger halls of Budapest's Western Railway Station, crowded with children and their families, other refugees fleeing other wars. To introduce our medalists this evening, I am pleased to present Mark Schlissel, President of the University of Michigan.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks very much, John, for the introduction and also for the really eloquent commentary on Raoul Wallenberg's life. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here to present the 24th Wallenberg Medal to tonight's distinguished honoree, Masha Gessen. I thank the members of the Wallenberg Committee and all those who have established and now carry forward the proud Wallenberg legacy at the University of Michigan. Raoul Wallenberg was one of the first Michigan alumni I learned about as I got to know the university. It takes a remarkable individual, a true hero, to transcend the length and the breadth of the University of Michigan's 2 centuries. We've been one of the world's premier university communities for nearly 200 years, built on a foundation of serving the public and achieving excellence and impact at the highest levels. The traditions we uphold as a community, and they are powerful here at the University of Michigan, include a deep commitment to improving our world. Regent Emeritus Phil Power published a piece in Bridge magazine last month that captured this idea. He said that, "What is remarkable and compelling about true excellence is that it brings with it the impulse for aspiration. The notion of excellence provides an aspirational standard for those who struggle for great achievement and who see in that struggle a link to their better selves." Our courageous alumnus, Raoul Wallenberg, represents these ideals in full measure. The lives he saved and the generations he inspires are strong reminders of one of our most closely held beliefs, that one person can make a difference. Wallenberg's legacy as it lives on today makes me very proud to be part of the Michigan community. Thanks to the work of many people here this evening, our university is advancing student learning beyond the classroom through the Wallenberg Fellows and the students who study and serve with help from our International Summer Travel Awards. These opportunities are made possible by individuals who've contributed to the Wallenberg Endowment over the last 30 years. I applaud their generosity and their vision for recognizing the importance of these types of engaged learning experiences for our students. This year's Wallenberg medalist has given us rare and profound insights into persecution, corruption, and the struggle for freedom by the oppressed. Masha Gessen is a preeminent journalist, author, and activist. She has chronicled Vladimir Putin's rise to power and the subsequent attacks, imprisonments, and assassinations of his opponents and his critics. She's also written about the plight of gays persecuted in Russia and the ethics and consequences surrounding the outings of high-profile Russians. In 2013, she left Russia for New York with her partner and their children in response to policies that threatened to take children away from gay parents. In a piece she wrote for The New Yorker in May, she discusses the poisonings and suspicious deaths that have befallen the dissidents of the regime in Russia, some of whom were journalists and advocates. They face a grim reality in their pursuit of human rights. I quote, "In the past few months, people who work at 2 Moscow restaurants have warned me separately about the precise locations of listening devices at the eateries. The warnings came unbidden." The food at both places was, incidentally, not only very good, but apparently safe. That, along with the springtime sun, helps maintain the bizarre sense of normalcy that has a way of going hand in hand with the mortal danger that has become a fact of everyday life. Her most recent work, titled The Brothers, The Road to an American Tragedy, delves deeply into the lives of the Tsarnaev brothers who perpetrated the Boston Marathon bombing. She travels to their homeland in the North Caucasus region and examines their immigration and lives in the United States. The book draws on her experience covering 2 wars in Chechnya. In her search for a motive, she also criticizes the American concept of terrorism that is rooted in radicalization. I'm very much looking forward to her talk tonight. I now ask that you please help me welcome the 2015 Wallenberg medalist, Masha Gessen.
Thank you. So, the first time I read about Raoul Wallenberg, I read a phrase that I have remembered for the rest of my life, and the phrase was, "This was a man who tried to save the world, and whom the world failed to save." The phrase was written by my mother. She was a journalist and literary critic who was probably the first person to write about Wallenberg in Russian. And this was back in 1981 or 1982, when Wallenberg's story first sort of came to broad public attention in the world, in this country and in Sweden, and to a small number of Russians living both in the Soviet Union and in this country. And that phrase has stayed with me, and I wanted to start with it today because I want to actually focus not on the part where one person can make a difference, but on the part where the world failed to save him. This summer, I took my daughter, who's 14, on a trip, the tour, as Israeli Jews call it, a trip in Eastern Europe. We went and studied monuments, Holocaust memorials all over Eastern Europe. And there's something striking about Budapest and the memorials there. There's one beautiful memorial to Raoul Wallenberg. It's these shoes that are on the bank of the Danube. And it's incredibly striking. There are the shoes, and you feel as though people have been pushed into the river, which is exactly what happened. People were shot on the bank of the Danube and fell into the river. There are 2 monuments to Karl Luntz, a Swiss diplomat who, as the Hungarians never tire of telling you, saved more Jews than Wallenberg. And there's one monument that we found, at least only one, to actual victims of the Holocaust. And that monument is in the courtyard of the synagogue in Budapest and is behind a fence, which I think is quite telling. And it's this sort of weeping willow. It's a striking monument in its own way. But I think in Budapest it really stands out, but it's actually true everywhere. It's so much more gratifying to remember the heroes than it is to remember the victims. And it's so much more gratifying to talk about it. And it leaves you all inspired. And that may be my job tonight, but that's not what I'm going to do. I would actually like to talk about the victims. And one other thing that I would like to point out about Wallenberg is that he got to Hungary in 1944. Right? That's more than 5 years after the start of World War II, or what we think of as the start of World War II. It's 11 years after the concerted persecution of Jews began in Germany. It's at least 3 years after the final solution started to be implemented. It's very, very late. It's not Wallenberg's fault. It's actually the world's fault. And by that I mean the Western world. In the final chapter of the origins of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt writes about something that, to me at least, is perhaps the most important idea of the many incredible ideas in the book. And that idea is that it was very difficult for the West to talk about totalitarian regimes because they seemed preposterous. Because who could really believe that you could use these simple ideas, like the idea that certain races were fated to die and only one race was fated to survive? Who could believe that that would lead to the extermination of millions of people? Who could really believe that the idea that certain classes were fated to survive and other classes were therefore fated to be exterminated? Who could believe that that idea was leading to the extermination of millions of people? We're so rational, and we don't like to believe in things that are preposterous. And it gives us a lot of satisfaction to feel more intelligent and to sort of sniff at things. And, you know, it's not only the West that does it. In my country, certainly, and right now when I say my country, I mean Russia. But in Russia, people say that it makes them feel smarter, you know, to snicker and snigger at the idea of the bloody regime or the murderous Kremlin. But that's actually what I want us to be paying attention to. It's so much better to turn out to have panicked in vain, to have had unjustified fear, to have let your imagination run wild with ideas of danger, than to have let down your fellow human beings because you didn't believe that they were in the kind of danger that they said they were in. And that's certainly what's happening with refugees in Europe now, and it's certainly what's happening in this country with its attitude toward refugees. John mentioned the refugees at who were gathering at the railroad station, the Keleti railroad station in Budapest. This summer, this country is raising its refugee quota by 10,000 people. That's embarrassing. This country has eviscerated its asylum system over the last 20 years. That's shameful. And I want to talk about what's going on in Russia, because I think that what's going on in Russia is getting the same sort of treatment as what was going on in Nazi Germany and what was going on in the Soviet Union was getting 50 or 70 years ago. I may be wrong, but I would rather be wrong in talking about the kind of danger that right now is facing my countrymen than be wrong about underestimating that danger. So I think what has happened in Russia in the last 3.5 years is what Hannah Arendt would have called preposterous, which is that Russia has basically been retrofitting a totalitarian regime. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we were all very hopeful. I was very hopeful. I went back to live in Russia. I was an American reporter at the time. I went back as a correspondent. I started writing in Russian. I thought that things were going to, were magically going to have democracy and all sorts of movements that I was used to having here, and I was going to be one of the people who helped bring that to my country. And there were certain things that we didn't pay any attention to. We didn't pay any attention to decisions that were made, for example, not to dismantle the monuments of communism, not to take Soviet movies off of television, and more serious decisions like the decision not to prosecute the organizers of the hardline coup in August 1991. Right? So if you remember, in August 1991, 8 men who were led by the KGB brass at the time placed Mikhail Gorbachev, the general secretary at the time, under house arrest, declared martial law, or what they called a state of emergency. The coup fizzled after 3 days. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. He then brokered an agreement to resign and hand power in Russia over to Boris Yeltsin and to dissolve the Soviet Union peacefully. And the 8 men, 2 of them had committed suicide, so the 6 remaining men who had organized the coup were amnestied. They had committed the gravest crime that anybody can commit against a state. They had placed the president under arrest, and they were amnestied because let's let bygones be bygones. The case against the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was never prosecuted. There was an 80-volume case that was assembled by the prosecutor's office. 2 copies of it are still in existence, as far as I know. And the case was never prosecuted because let's not create a witch hunt. Let's let sleeping dogs lie. And so we went through the 90s. Some of us were hugely hopeful. Some of us were horribly disoriented. And those of us who were just growing up in the 1990s were growing up in this environment where their parents were horribly disoriented and frightened. And they themselves were watching Soviet movies on television and seeing sort of beauty and certainty on TV. And seeing that ideology that was somehow no longer taken seriously. Seeing that propaganda and seeing that as the one place of sort of safety and certainty in their lives, their parents' lives that had been uprooted. And they walked around every day on streets that were lined with monuments to Lenin and to other Soviet heroes, and where the buildings had the Soviet state seal on them and the hammer and sickle. It's a little bit like walking around, post-World War II Germany and seeing the swastika everywhere and thinking nothing of it. It's not nothing. And what I think it is actually is it's like if totalitarianism, again, as Hannah Arendt described totalitarianism, it begins with an idea. It's usually a simple idea, and it's an idea that's used to explain everything. The simpler, the better. And again, it's so primitive that it seems preposterous. And on this idea, a whole logical sort of construction is built. And from that logical construction, the laws of history are derived. And then the government positions itself as the agent of these laws of history. It needs to act to speed up the progress of history as is dictated by the laws of history. So if the laws of history are such that certain races need to be exterminated or that certain classes are destined to die off, then we need to carry out those laws by exterminating the races or the classes. It's particularly convenient in the case of the classes because the definition of belonging to that class that is subject to extermination is entirely in the eye of the beholder. So that what happened to Soviet ideology was that that whole sort of logical infrastructure, or the whole logical construction that was built on top of the idea, was never dissembled. The only thing that happened was that the basic idea, the one single idea, the simple idea, was removed. That idea of that certain there was class warfare and certain classes were not fated to survive. The rest of it was kind of suspended in midair, in need of a new idea. And the need for a new idea was very strongly felt. The first post-Soviet Russian president Boris Yeltsin, actually convened a commission to come up with a new national idea. And they met a number of times. They never came up with a new national idea, and they gave up. The idea with which Vladimir Putin came into office a staggering 16 years ago was a sort of vague nostalgic idea. He had no ideology. He really was a sort of post-ideological politician, but he mongered in something that there was a Soviet nostalgia. He talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union as having been the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of our time. He gradually began the whitewashing of the Stalinist period by talking about what a great manager Joseph Stalin had been, and his incontrovertible achievement of having triumphed in World War II. He started restoring the mythology of World War II, which is very important for Russia. It's sort of the fact of history that justifies everything. It justifies the terror that came before it, and because it made the Soviet Union a superpower, it justifies everything that came after it. It is the great legitimizing myth of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, one of the first things that Yeltsin did was he discontinued the military parades on Victory Day that celebrated the anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War, which is the Soviet part of World War II, the 4 years between 1941 and 1945, when the Soviet Union stopped being an ally of Nazi Germany and became its enemy. It was a highly symbolic act, discontinuing the military parades. Not only did Yeltsin stop them, he actually had a new gate erected at the entrance to Red Square, which theoretically made it impossible for military equipment to be brought into Red Square for the parades. That was a highly symbolic act. As we learned later, Red Square actually has 2 entrances. They forgot to block the other one off. In 1999, in part as a response to the NATO bombing of Rump Yugoslavia as part of the Kosovo campaign, Russia renewed the military parades on Victory Day. Not in Red Square at first, but once Putin came back into office in Red Square. So for the first 12 years, the 8 years that Putin was in the office of president, and then 4 more years when he had a certain Dmitry Medvedev keeping his chair warm, Putin was mongering in Soviet nostalgia and gradually reviving the mythology of the Great Patriotic War. When he came back into office in 2012, he came back at a very difficult moment. He came back faced with mass protests in the country. He had to do something radical. He cracked down politically. He introduced all these laws to limit the right to public assembly, to frighten people into staying off the streets by imposing backbreaking fines and the threat of arrest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the most important thing he did was he sort of backed into an ideology. It happened by accident. I think what he was trying to do is he was trying to paint the protesters as other. He tried many different things to do that. He tried saying that they were funded by the US State Department. He tried saying they were personally inspired by Hillary Clinton. And then when he finally started queer-baiting them, that's when it worked. And that's when, and this is actually not dissimilar to the way another great writer, Victor Klemperer, describes what was happening in Nazi Germany. There was a sort of piecemeal assembling of what was going to become the ideology. It seemed chaotic at the time, and it seemed almost accidental when Putin was doing it now. But it seemed that the queerbaiting was working so well that he could. It had so much traction that he could get deeper into the subject, and this idea of the traditional civilization presented itself. And the idea of the traditional civilization is a perfectly primitive and preposterous idea. And the way it works, and now I'm quoting the philosopher who actually came up with this, is the West has its idea of universal human rights. And that's fine. Yeah, if the West wants it to have its idea of universal human rights and give human rights to all sorts of people, including the post-gender people and the post-human people, then, I'm quoting, then that's okay. It will clearly lead the West to ruin. But there's more than one civilization in the world. There's also the traditional values civilization. And there's nothing, this is a key phrase, there's nothing universal about human rights. Right? And the traditional values civilization is here to tell you that there's nothing universal about human rights. The traditional values civilization is a geographically expansive and non-specific idea. It can be the former Soviet Union. It can also include many other countries, as Russia has repeatedly demonstrated. It can include Syria. It can also include Ukraine. What's Russia doing in Ukraine? In Ukraine, Russia is protecting traditional values, because as the chairman of the Russian Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee said when he was introducing the first Russian resolution on Ukraine in December 2013, if Ukraine moves west, then that will broaden the sphere of influence of the gay culture, which is the official policy of the European Union. Sounds preposterous, right? But it's the rationale for going to war in Ukraine. We try to be smarter in that. We try to take it more seriously. We try to not engage the preposterous ideas. We talk about how Putin has strategic interests in Ukraine. We talk about how Putin wants territory in Ukraine. We talk about how Putin needs, a land connection between eastern Ukraine and Crimea. We do everything but listen to him. And we do everything but listen to what he's saying very explicitly. He sees Russia as having a civilizational mission. He sees Russia as going to war to protect traditional values. That's what he's doing, as absurd as that may sound. So remember that whole totalitarian construction that was suspended in midair? It's like a car that had been put on blocks. And now suddenly they've backed into this ideology of traditional values, and it's like slapping wheels onto this car, and the thing starts rolling. And it's very exciting to some people. And the thing starts rolling, and the gears sort of start moving, and the mechanisms kick in. We don't actually know what's rusted out in this car. We don't know how long it's going to be able to run on fumes. I'm sorry to belabor the metaphor, but I like it. But we've actually never seen this happen before, right? Totalitarianism is a new phenomenon historically. It's a 20th century phenomenon, and the 20th century saw a number of totalitarian regimes being constructed. We've never actually seen what happens when a totalitarian regime exists for a really long time, then stops existing, but never is fully deconstructed, and then parts of it kick back into action. We don't actually know what happens next. What I fear is that the fuel of a totalitarian regime is mass terror. And the Soviet Union, the late Soviet Union, ran on the memory of mass terror. That is like running on fumes. What we have now in Russia is the memory of mass terror. It's working really, really well right now. It's working to the tune of 86 to 89% support for what Putin is doing, right? And that's, when you hear those numbers, and I'm sure you've all read about them, right, because they're shocking. And I'm often asked, is that really what people think? Is that really the state of public opinion in Russia? Do 86% of Russians really support Putin? And the implication of that question is, well, if they really all do support Putin, then who are we to tell them that they're wrong? The thing is that there actually isn't, I hope, a society in the world or a functioning democratic society in the world in which 86% of people think anything. Right? That number itself is a very important, a very frightening symptom. And it's a symptom, again, of something that Hannah Arendt described, which is that the difference between tyranny and totalitarianism is that tyranny forces behaviors onto people, but totalitarianism doesn't just force opinions onto people, it robs them of the very ability to form opinions. And when I now think back to that exciting time when the Soviet Union was falling apart and when everybody seemed to be swept up in the democratic idea and everybody seemed to be swept up in this love of the universal idea of human rights, which we now find out is not universal, I think with horror that was part of the same phenomenon. The reason the whole country could be swept up in that was that it had been, people had been taught that the most important survival skill that they could have is the skill of knowing which way the wind is blowing and running faster than everybody else in that particular direction. That direction could be democracy, that direction could be human rights, and then that direction could be Soviet nostalgia, and now that direction is protecting this idea of traditional values. Now, Putin has made no secret of what he's doing. The problem with understanding Putin has been with our resistance to believing something that seems, again, preposterous. Right? He has been very open about the fact that he is going to war, not for territories, but for the idea of protecting the traditional value of civilization. And most recently, he's talked about war as an end in itself. His speech just last month to a group of international Russia scholars was about the exceptional nature, the anomalous nature of peace. Right, so he was speaking at a Kremlin-organized junket devoted to the concept of war and peace. And he basically said peace is an anomalous state. It's an idealized state of being for the world and for humanity. But it will always remain an ideal. The state of equilibrium for the world is actually war. And so by going to war, he's bringing the world into a state of equilibrium, and it's all the fault of the United States, which thinks that it is the dominant power in a unipolar world, which is forcing Russia to balance the world by going to war. Okay. In the conversation about foreign policy in the West, and this is true both of the United States and of Europe, not only are these ideas not heard, and is he not taken seriously because it's very difficult to take seriously, but also because the implications of taking it seriously are very dire, right? It basically, foreign policy is based on the idea that actions have consequences, that foreign policy will have tangible results. We measure the foreign policy by how much it has been able to influence the behavior of a particular country, or how much closer it has gotten us to a particular goal. So the question we ask is, what can the United States do to change Putin's behavior? And the fallacy that that's based on is the fallacy that the United States can do something to change Putin's behavior. There's actually no reason to believe that. The man has been very open about the fact that he's dead set on fighting a war for the sake of fighting a war, and on escalating for the sake of escalating. Again, his idea is that he's on a civilizational mission. It is his goal to maintain the conflict, the clash of civilizations, as he sees it. And the idea that you can impose sanctions and that way change his behavior is absurd on the face of it. But of course, we only believe the political conversation when it's pragmatic and when it's based on this idea that, that anything that we do will have real consequences. No politician is allowed to say it's impossible. It's impossible is a phrase that we can use in private life, and it sounds reasonable. It's impossible to deal with this person. He's always late, he's always drunk, and he never repays his debts. And if you have a brain, you will learn from that eventually and stop lending him money. If you live in the same, if he's your roommate, then maybe you'll try to figure out ways of splitting the bills because he's not going to pay on time. This idea that something can be impossible is not, we don't allow politicians to say that. We don't allow that to enter our political thinking. Everything has to be rational, everything has to be strategic as perhaps selling Raoul Wallenberg selling Raoul Wallenberg out was. Nobody tried to save Raoul Wallenberg when he disappeared into the Soviet Gulag, because Sweden had other important strategic goals. I think this is symbolic of the kinds of mistakes we make now. We talk about strategic goals instead of talking about the right thing to do, instead of talking about who we are and what this country is, what the West is, what the universal idea of human rights is, and what the implications of those ideals are if we take them seriously. If we take the threat to them seriously, and if we take them seriously. That requires a whole other kind of work, and it requires a whole other kind of imagination. And it requires a whole other kind of imagination in both directions, both in being able to imagine something horrible happening, something as awful as something that we couldn't believe 70 years ago and that ended up happening, and that's as horrible as the things we can't believe now. But also that it requires being able to imagine that politics based on morals, that politics based on ideals will ultimately yield results that politics based on a limited, unimaginative idea of reality and strategy never will. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Shall we take questions? I'll direct you. They're usually pretty lively.
I'm sorry?
They're usually pretty lively.
Sure.
So thank you. As our usual customary practice, we have 2 microphones for questions for Masha this evening. One is over here and one's up there. If someone would like to step forward and pose some questions.
Hi. Is it on? Yeah. So in your lecture, you discussed that we should start taking Putin and we should start taking the situation in Russia seriously. So as a government in America, what should our next steps be? What does taking Putin seriously look like?
Right. So the next step is changing the conversation. And this is where I get to say that Fortunately, I'm not a policymaker, I'm a journalist. My job is to criticize, not to make policy. I try to do my job well. But I think that, so let's take something very limited, like sanctions. So both the United States and Western Europe have imposed a series of sanctions on Russia and on certain Russian individuals separately. And there has been a certain logic behind those sanctions. The logic has been that if we impose the sanctions gradually, then Putin will see that they're having an impact on his economy and will change his behavior. That is demonstrably not effective. It was also predictably not effective. But it goes along with this idea that, that we have to be realistic and strategic, and that the only reason to do something is because it's going to work. What I'm suggesting is that the reason to do something is not that it's going to work, but that it's the right thing to do. Sanctions may be the right thing to do. I think they are the right thing to do, but for other reasons. Because it's wrong to have dealings with a criminal regime, because it's wrong to have dealings with Putin personally. But if you think of them that way, they're imposed differently, right? You don't impose them gradually, because you don't try to communicate to Putin step by step that you think that it's the wrong thing to do to have dealings with him. You impose sanctions all at once. Will they have a different impact? I don't know if they will have a different impact on Russia. That's no longer the question. The question is, what kind of impact will they have on this country? Because that would be the reason to impose those sanctions, because they're the right thing to do.
I have a question about the journalistic truth in journalism. So if sometimes there is factual truth, and there is truth with interpretation. And sometimes, for example, in your book about Tsarnaev's brothers, you kind of reconstruct a three-dimensional picture. You reconstruct a tragedy, and you give, instead of one-dimensional, two-dimensional truth, you give as many dimensions as you can find. In the other example, where you went to Kiev to the gay parade, and you wrote in the New Yorker an article which is kind of been there, done that, seen that. That's an example of more factual truth. So who's making a choice? You making a choice, or how do you make this choice? How to present the truth in different cases?
I mean, I don't think there's actually a difference between factual truth and truth in interpretation. And it's not that I'm not one of those people who will tell you that there is no such thing as truth, or we don't know what the truth is. I just think that truth is always a story, and it always, there's no such thing as bare facts. Facts are always selected, and they're always interpreted. There are different ways of interpreting facts. There are different voices in which you can tell a story. And of course, the choice of voice and the choice of length and the choice of genre, it all depends on the circumstances. When I went to Kiev, I wrote a story that night, the night of the Pride March in Kiev that was attacked by right-wing thugs. I was in no position to get estrangement from that story. I was in a position to tell about the experience of having, I don't want to assume that everybody has read my New Yorker blog post about the Kiev Pride. So this June, I went to Kiev to the LGBT Pride March, which was actually called the Equality March. And I went there because I was supposed to be the speaker at their Pride event. And the march itself, which was on the morning of the day when I was supposed to speak, was brutally attacked, and it turned into this horrible scene where people were running all over a neighborhood, being chased by armed thugs. Somewhere around 20 people were injured, more than half of them policemen, one of them critically. It was a bloodbath, and I had just come out of that bloodbath, and I was feeling very lucky to be alive, and I wanted to tell that story in a very immediate way. And it would have been a lie to try to gain perspective on it and to try to pretend that I had distance. I had no distance. I had a very scary personal experience that I thought it was useful to describe, so I described it that way. When I write a book that is going to be on the shelves for a while, having learned the hard way not to put too much immediate reporting in it because it gets old very fast, like when I finished my Putin book with this very optimistic epilogue that stemmed from the protest movement. I try to be more careful about the interpretation. I have gained the experience necessary to get some distance and try to tell the story in a more rounded way.
Recently, I read in the New York Times, Vladimir Putin was quoted as saying that he thought that global warming is a fraud perpetrated by the United States, in part to prevent Russia from developing. And that statement, in addition to what he says about gays, I find myself wondering, how many of these things does he actually believe, and how much of it is pure demagoguery? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, see, that's a great question in connection with what I was just talking about, because I think that the thing that Hannah Arendt wasn't able to describe is what happens when you have totalitarianism for generations, and when you have these people who are products of a totalitarian society running not a totalitarian society now, but post-pre-totalitarian society. I don't think he has that organ that is responsible for actually believing something. It's been bred out of him. He's more sensitive than anyone else in the country to which way the wind is blowing, because he's doing the blowing, right? But then he starts running in that direction faster than anybody else, and it's as sincere as anything else. But it has all the characteristics of that weirdness that happens to beliefs in a totalitarian society, and one of them is that it can change on a dime. Because again, that the glue or whatever it is that's responsible inside of us for having core beliefs, for having values, it's just not there.
Hi. First, thank you for coming. You're quite inspiring to me, and I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
And my question relates to how you were talking about the impending war that you believe will be coming. And it's instilled in me this sense of urgency that something needs to be done relatively soon. And it just doesn't seem like with the current situation in this country even, that the government might be capable of stopping Putin, as it appears that we should be able to do, but it just doesn't seem that that is going to happen right now. And I was just wondering, besides changing the conversation and trying not to have such a pessimistic view, what do you think is the hope of overcoming this problem?
Is the what? I'm sorry?
Overcoming this problem.
I don't know that this problem can be overcome. I know that it is poisonous to this society to not take it seriously. I think that that lies are destructive to those who tell them and those who believe them. And the lies on which foreign policy is based are terrible for this country, whether or not Putin can do real damage to this country. So I think that changing the conversation is the important thing to do. Changing the way we think and talk about the world is huge, and changing the way we think and talk about ourselves is huge. I think that's enough. That's a very ambitious idea.
Thank you.
Thank you for your very insightful analysis and sort of a short description of what you think is going on in Russia. In the last few sentences of your speech, you said that you think there is nothing that the US, or well, I don't know if you meant the US or the West in general, at this point can do in terms of foreign policy to make things in Russia better. Is that right? Now, in conjunction with that, when you say the US or the West should now act from the point of view of what's moral, from the point of view of what's good, what's right, do you think that, do you share in my fear that it could actually, this stance could further antagonize Russia into an even less controlled state, even since, you know, one of the criticisms that Russians field against the U.S. and the West is that they're moralizing at us. They're acting holier than us. They think they're better than us. They're not. Is the question clear? Can you make it worse by saying we will not deal with you because what you're going through is horrible, immoral, bad?
I very much doubt that it's possible to make it worse. I very much doubt that it's possible to antagonize Russia further. Russia has actually auto-antagonized itself extremely effectively without much input from the United States. And there's like a peculiar doubling back of this imperial idea, right? We have created the monster by by expanding NATO. We have created the monster by not being nice enough to Putin. First of all, that's a counterfactual. That's that's actually not what has been happening over the last 20 years. But also, there's something about that whole idea that denies Russia agency. Actually, Russia has sort of super agency. Russia has its own completely self-created picture of itself in the world, and the United States as its ultimate enemy, created with no help from the United States. So the United States actually really needs to look at its place in the world, and not at what it thinks, without much basis for thinking so, will influence Russia in this way or that way.
So you keep talking about taking Putin more seriously. So he's shown that, excuse me, he'll kill high-profile people, like Nemtsov this past year, and borders can't protect people like Litvinenko in the UK. So are you gonna slow down at some point? Are you fearing for your own life, or is that not really something it's actively on your mind?
I think that there are a lot of people in Russia who are in actual danger. I am in such a luxurious position. First of all, I'm living in this country, and I have been here for nearly 2 years. My family's here. It's impossible to put pressure on me by threatening my family, which is what they tried to use just before we left the country, and that was the reason we left the country. I think I'm also, I'm not so foolhardy as to think I'm fully protected, but I'm certainly protected to a large extent by being known in this country and being published all over the West. My book about Putin was published in 20 languages. There are people who are doing work on the ground in Russia that exposes them to daily danger that you've never heard of. I mean, Russia is consistently at the top of the Committee to Protect Journalists impunity rating. And if you open the Committee to Protect Journalists website and look at crimes committed against journalists in Russia, you will see that you've never heard any of those names. And that's the biggest risk factor, is being on the ground and being unknown anywhere else, not having the eyes of the world on you. So in that sense, I don't even think it's right for me to talk publicly about what little risk I may be facing when there are people who take such great risks every day and we don't even know about them.
Thank you.
Hi. So you mentioned leaving hammer and sickle symbols up in Russia as being kind of analogous to having symbols of like Nazi Germany left after the Holocaust. And I'm just curious because as the kind of radical anti-capitalist left movement in the United States seems to glorify Soviet Russia a lot. And I identify as an anti-capitalist, but I've always been kind of uncomfortable with the use of that hammer and sickle, in particular symbolism that seems to proliferate through these movements in the US. So I was just wondering what your kind of feelings or responses to that are.
Well, my personal feeling is that it gives me the creeps. But I think, symbols can be contextualized. I think that there's symbols of communism can actually mean different things in different places. In the Soviet Union, and what used to be the Soviet Union, these things stood for the state. They stood for the state that had killed millions in its name, that had destroyed institutions in its name, that had suppressed freedom for 70 years in its name. Those symbols were contextualized. I don't think that my daughter, I live in New York City now, my daughter goes to school in the East Village. There's a building 2 blocks from her school that has a huge statue of Lenin on it. I don't think that her thinking is going to be corrupted by walking past the statue. I think that the thinking of today's 30-year-olds was affected in a significant way by walking past Lenin statues that stood in central squares of their cities and towns all over Russia when they were growing up. I mean, that's a different story.
Thank you.
You mentioned that under a totalitarian regime, people lose their ability to form their own opinions, and I was wondering if you had thoughts on what it takes to recover from that as a people.
Oh, that's a great question. So the question is, what does it take to recover from, and I'm going to rephrase the question, let me know if this is okay. What does it take to recover from the trauma of having grown up under totalitarianism, right?
Yes.
So I think this is, and this sounds very obvious when you think about it, but this is not something that we talked about in the 90s, right? We assumed that if you take a country that had been abused and traumatized for decades, and just say, okay, here, freedom, money, laws, privatization, go, be a normal country. And then we're surprised that it's not a normal country. And again, I think the utility of comparing people to countries is somewhat limited, but I think this is the second time I'm going to do this today, because I actually think it's useful. But if we take people who've been abused, and we take them out of a situation of abuse, we know, right, at least in this country, that unless they have a lot of help, unless they have a lot of therapy, they're not going to be able to move on and live a normal life. In fact, what they're going to do is they're going to recreate the situation of abuse. It really shouldn't surprise us that Russia has gone back and recreated the situation of abuse. It is genuinely more comfortable for a lot of people in that country to live in a state of low-level dread, to live in a state where they have significantly limited means, to live in a state of being constantly mobilized, of a mobilized society. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be so. They haven't gotten the help to recover from that, either from the outside or from inside the country. I mean, the first post-Soviet government couldn't be bothered to even talk about ideas, to even talk about the trauma that people were experiencing. It was actually fundamentally Marxist in its approach. They're like, life is going to change and people's thinking is going to change. Well, actually, as it turns out, that's not how it works. I don't have an answer, right? It clearly takes a lot to recover from the trauma, and clearly Russia hasn't done that. It seems if we look at other post-communist countries, the satellite states in Eastern Europe, it really helps if they have a coherent story to tell themselves about what happened to them, right? If the country can tell itself, we were occupied, we're really a good people that was occupied first by the Soviets and then by the Nazis, and then by the Soviets again, or if it was just the Nazis and the Soviets. And then finally we're left to ourselves and we can be good people again. That's a great way of getting a head start on recovery. What Russia needs to do is something that no country has ever done and that may actually not be possible, which is deal with the fact that it's a country that did this to itself. It's a country where you cannot, unlike in post-Nazi Germany, you can't separate the perpetrators from the victims from the bystanders. Everybody was a perpetrator, everybody was a victim, nobody was a bystander. And it lasted for generations. And there's no good way to tell that story. It may actually be impossible.
Thank you.
If I'm understanding this right, you're describing Russia today as a totalitarian state in search of an ideology to justify its totalitarianism. Because it doesn't have that ideology, or maybe it's founded in gay bashing, because it doesn't have that ideology, how do we engage with it considering that its ideologies are continuously shifting? And the second part of that, is that still the wrong way to think about it? Is that still thinking about it in terms of, oh, there must be some sort of utilitarian tactic that I can take in order to change Russia's behavior? And if that's the case, how do we remove that ethic from our political life? I mean, we're up to the upteenth attempt at regime change that's completely failed, and it doesn't seem to have taken hold that our attempts to act in our best interests are precisely what are hurting our best interests.
So I don't actually think that Russia is a country without an ideology.
Okay.
I think that there's a common misconception about ideology, that ideology needs to be coherent and complicated, and it's something, big and interesting. And that's why I started this talk by talking about how preposterous and primitive it has been, the totalitarian ideologies have been in the past, and this one is no different. It's preposterous and primitive, and it doesn't tell an interesting story, but it's sufficient. And it's probably sufficient, especially for a country that has the experience of being a totalitarian society. So it easily moves back into that space, given half an opportunity. The answer to the second half of your question is yes. I think that is still the wrong way to think about it. I think that if you want to think about it in some way, other than if you don't want to take my prescription of thinking about ourselves first, then what I would suggest is think about what happens after. There's always an after. And all closed systems eventually implode. This system is no different. We can't predict it when it's going to happen. It is really and truly a closed system. The Soviet Union looked like it was going to be forever until it collapsed. And it seemed to collapse virtually overnight. That's actually what's happened to most closed systems that we have observed. That's certainly what's going to happen to this one. Maybe next year, maybe in 20 years, I have no idea. And there's going to be an after. And another good way to apply our imagination is to think about what happens then. Is that country going to stay within its current borders? If parts of it are going to split off, what's the best way to help those parts? Actually, maybe the best way to help those parts is to start now by helping Ukraine secure its state. Right? But not thinking about how to strategically deal with Russia and oppose it in Ukraine, but to think about how to help Ukraine secure its statehood and its selfhood. Right? And then again, what happens to Russia after the regime implodes? Who are possible actors? What are possible borders? What are the possible problems and fates of the chunks that split off?
So letting Russia deal with itself and dealing with ourselves in our own way based on what we conceive of as our basic value set.
Yes, and basically I think we don't have a choice. That we lie to ourselves when we think that we can deal with Russia.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So it's sort of related to the last question. So considering this Roman ideal of patria, the fatherland, and all the structures that define a nation. Do you agree that it is not possible to overcome certain ideals, especially negative ones, once they have been an intrinsic part of the nation? Do you think that a nation that has been exposed to an ideology, a doctrine of an authoritarian regime for an extended period of time can still exist as a unified nation after this long period of time, after the ideals have been eradicated?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I think I'm in the business of describing and telling stories, and I'm not a theoretician. So if I try to apply that question to Russia, which I think I'm pretty good at describing, I don't think the issue is ideals, and I don't think the issue is indoctrination. It's not that Russia is so attached to particular ideals. It's not that Russians are particularly attached to particular ideals. I mean, most of what passed for communist ideology, I try to phrase that carefully because I think it would be inaccurate to call it a communist ideology, but most of what passed for it vanished almost without a trace. What we actually, there are a lot of remnants of the way people were taught and the basic things that that people were and particularly weren't educated in. But that's education and information. It's not ideals, right? And in fact, if anything, I think that one of the scariest things to me about Russia is the basic belief that nothing is real, that there are no values. That I mean, there's sort of a second layer behind this this idea that there's nothing universal about universal human rights, which, if you talk to Russians, especially especially people who come into contact with Westerners, who have to sort of build a line of defense, they will tell you, look, we know how the world works. We know it's rotten to the core. We know everything is for sale. Russians are just honest about it. Yeah. And you Americans, you insist on putting on airs and talking about, the moral this, moral that, right this, rule of law, whatever. If given half an opportunity, you'd violate those laws. I think that's a very deeply held, not, I don't know if I would call it an idea. It's a perception of the world. And that actually enables this, this change of ideologies, the way that decorations are changed, because nothing is real, except that everything is for sale.
Thanks. Hi. Do you think we are being too hard on Russia when we are criticizing Russian human rights record? What I mean by this is, it seems like we have almost two different standards. One that we apply to, Western civilization, white Judeo-Christian civilization, and the one that's for everyone else. So judging by the, the Judeo-Christian Western criteria, it seems like, Russia's human rights record is truly horrible compared, and it is compared to, United States, Western Europe. But at the same time, as we are imposing sanctions on Russia, and I agree they're not imposed over human rights record. We are warming up to countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and countries that are clearly doing a lot worse when it comes to human rights records. For example, there were talks of boycott of Sochi Olympics over horrible anti-gay laws in Russia. But with that being said, the situation for the LGBT in Russia is still infinitely better than in some of these, let's say, Middle Eastern countries.
I mean, you're right at pointing out the difficulty with what I'm proposing. If we start thinking about politics in moral terms, we have to start thinking about politics in absolute terms, and then the world begins to look more and more awful the more you look at it. I happen to think that human rights are indeed universal, no, I don't think we're too hard on Russia. I think we may be too soft on other countries. I think that, that doesn't mean that there has to be the impossible standard of criticizing everybody over everything all the time. That's not practically possible. I think there were good reasons to go after the anti-gay stuff around the time of the Sochi Olympics. And one of the reasons was that Russia did something very peculiar, which is that it threw itself in reverse. Right? There absolutely are countries where laws and realities for LGBT people are much, much darker than they are in Russia. Right? There are countries where the same-sex relationships are punishable by the death penalty. There are a number of those countries in the world. I think we're still in a situation where in a majority of countries in the world, there's some sort of criminal penalty for same-sex relations. At the same time, we actually hadn't seen this before. We hadn't seen a country where a fair number of people were leading fairly open lives, possibly not publicly open, but open enough to a social circle, right, where their neighbors knew, their doctor knew, their parents knew, and all of a sudden they were under attack by those very people and institutions that had been hospitable. And where so many people were exposed to that kind of risk and that kind of violence all at once.
I can think of Iran before 1979.
I don't think it's comparable. I mean, look, we get into this weird territory where we start comparing things, and which is worse. I don't think it's on this particular issue. You can't compare Iran in 1979 to Russia in 2013 for the simple reason that the concept of LGBT rights as an international human rights issue didn't even exist in 1979.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm just curious to know what you read. Journalists and historians, what do you read to understand Russia? You mentioned Hannah Arendt several times.
Right. I think that it is good to read Hannah Arendt constantly, at least once a year. I read a lot of stuff. I mean, to understand, to follow current events, I read a very bizarre mixture of journalistic reports and blogs. Mm-hmm. At this point, increasingly blogs. I get somewhat nervous about the number of perspectives I'm able to get, because even though I have a number of hedges against sort of this the tunneling of my vision. It's still very, very difficult to protect oneself against it, even being in Russia, but especially being outside of Russia. And as far as understanding, I mean, I'm writing a book about retrofitting totalitarianism right now. So I'm reading a lot of things, and I'm doing a lot of interviews.
But could you name them?
Could I name them?
Yes.
Okay. So the book I'm reading right now is called Eros Невозможного by Alexander Etkind. It's a book. It's a history of psychoanalysis in Russia and the Soviet Union. It's great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura, and I just first want to say it's very cool to be able to see you speak live. I'm very much enjoying this, so thank you for coming to Ann Arbor. You have spent a lot of time talking about this sort of wall in believing what is right in front of us because it is preposterous. And that sort of perhaps maybe a step in the right direction is to change the conversation and us to recognize what's preposterous. And I'm wondering, given that what's happening right now in the US, we have a wall to seeing what's right in front of us. There are peacekeepers are killing innocent people night and day. We never thought a bloviating narcissist would be this close to the White House. Even one of the least seemingly preposterous candidates out there, who's actually great, said offhand, Putin will come around. So do you have a suggestion for a lot of blind US citizens how we're supposed to open our eyes as to what's right in front of us in the rest of the world when we're having so much trouble doing it here?
Yeah. No, so I think when I bike, I listen to podcasts all the time. And so there was one time when I was listening to all these political podcasts, one after another, and all these political pundits saying, oh, it would be great if, Democratic pundits, it would be great if Donald Trump became the Republican candidate because he could never be elected. And my reaction was exactly that. No, believe the impossible. I really think that if somebody were inclined to write the history of the 20th century through the prism of the failure of the imagination, that would be a really good project. and I think if we use our imaginations and let them run wild and develop a thick skin in relation to criticism, levied against us for imagining things too wildly, we will probably be much more realistic than we are now.
We have time for one more question, but then I want to put a quick question.
Thank you for being here.
Thank
Could
you.
you comment on the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the situation in Russia today?
So, the Russian Orthodox Church, that's one of my favorite questions, and I apologize to those who've heard me answer it a couple of times since I got on campus, but the Russian Orthodox Church has historically been a part of the Russian state. Right? So it's actually, this is a classic question that we ask from an American framework. Right? Assuming that there's a separation of church and state. It's a little bit like asking, what's the role of the right hand and what the left hand is doing. Generally speaking, they're attached to the same body. Historically, the Russian Orthodox Church has been a state church. After 1917, the Bolshevik government claimed to vanquish organized religion. That wasn't exactly what happened. It was greatly weakened. It was rejuvenated at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, when the government was in disarray and despair and needed something that would help it mobilize the troops. There's actually a very good book about it, to the person who asked what I read to understand stuff. So this was a couple of books ago. I read this book called Russia's Holy War or just the Holy War, but it's Stephen Miner, and it's about the use of the Russian Orthodox Church during World War II, and basically in the entire post-war period, right? So for most at this point of Russia's recent history, the Orthodox Church served at the pleasure of the Kremlin, as did other organized religions. And if you actually watch Putin, he's not just talking to the Orthodox Church, he's talking to his pocket Muslims, he's talking to his pocket chief rabbi of Russia, and he's greatly weakened the alternative chief rabbi of Russia and kicked out a couple of other rabbis because they were getting in the way. And it's sort of the KGB pattern of dealing with organized religion. In the 1970s and 80s, the conflict between Christian dissidents and the state was played out through the church, which was at which served the state. And there was some dissident clergy who went to jail and who were basically seen to jail by the KGB clergy. Now we have a president and a patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church who are both former KGB agents. They come from the same corporation. They're colleagues, and they run the country collegially.
Now, it's my final question. Masha, I wonder, since you're a storyteller, I wonder if you could tell us about how you first heard about Ann Arbor.
I'm so glad you asked that question. How much time do I have? So, when I was growing up, we had these books, and These books were, they were the best books in the house. They looked a little weird. They had these glossy, monochromatic covers, and then they had a little horse carriage as the logo. And the first book I think I read, or at least the first book I saw that had the horse carriage, was Nabokov's Ada in Russian. And the horse carriage clearly came from the novel, so I thought it was like some sort of publishing house that existed solely for the novel, which actually wasn't too far from the truth. And in all these other books, they all had the horse carriage, and the words under it were An Arbor, which I thought was a magical place somewhere. And it was the magical place where the best books came from. As I found out many, many years later, through a whole other series of coincidences, what had actually happened was that a University of Michigan Slavics professor named Karl Proffer and his graduate student bride named Elendea had traveled to the Soviet Union in the late 60s and early 70s, made a whole lot of friends among dissidents and writers and artists, including my mother's best friend, who lived in the apartment next door to ours. Her husband at the time had a collection of books of poetry published in Russia in the 1920s, during the Silver Age of Russian poetry. All of those poets had either been depublished or explicitly banned in the Soviet Union. And so the Proffers came up with this idea of taking pictures of these books and smuggling them out on microfilm, not for the purpose of viewing them on microfilm machines, but for the purpose of having the smallest possible physical carrier for them, and then printing them in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and smuggling them back into the country. So they printed those poetry books and Nabokov's Ada, because they were huge fans of Nabokov, and he allowed them to do the first Russian language edition of Ada, which he had just written. And then they would wind their way back to Moscow, being smuggled back in at great risk to whoever was carrying them, and into our apartment, when really all we had to do was go over next door and borrow the book. But I found out about that when artist was having its 25th anniversary party in the apartment next door. And I hadn't realized that had been the source of all these books. And but the words An Arbor continued to have this magical ring to me. And I'd never actually come here until now. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is really terrific. I'll conclude it. Thank you. Thank you.
On behalf of the Wallenberg Committee, I'd like to thank Masha Gessen, and I'd also like to thank our American Sign Language translators, Christine Saunders and Lindsay Wygant, for a great job. Thank you and good evening.